Can you hide my daughter for one night? Richard Miller had rehearsed 100 different ways to say it on the drive over. None of them came out right. What came out was raw, a father stripped down to nothing but desperation and love. The man standing in the doorway looked like he could bend iron with his hands. And Richard, who had never asked anyone for anything in 58 years, stood there in the gravel at midnight and said the only thing left he had to say. If this story moves you, subscribe to this channel right now, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that midnight knock. The truck had been sitting in the parking lot of a closed gas station for 11 minutes before Richard finally pulled back onto the road. He didn't tell Sophie why he stopped. She didn't ask. They had been doing that all night, moving through silence, the way people move through fog, carefully, slowly, afraid of what might be on the other side of it. Sophie was in the passenger seat with her knees pulled up to her chest and her arms wrapped around a gray canvas laptop bag, like it was the only solid thing left in the world. Maybe it was. Richard had stopped asking her what was in it 3 weeks ago, when she looked at him with eyes that were exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep and said, "Dad, the less you know, the safer you are." He had hated her for saying that, not because it wasn't true, because it was. Richard Miller had spent 31 years as a construction foreman in western Pennsylvania. He had poured foundations, framed walls, overseen crews of 20 men through ice storms and 100-degree heat. He understood pressure. He understood load-bearing. He understood that some things crack quietly before they collapse completely, and by the time you hear it, it's already too late to brace. His daughter had cracked 3 months ago. He hadn't heard it until she showed up at his door at 2 in the morning with a bruise along her jaw that she said was from walking into a cabinet door and a look in her eyes that said something else entirely. "Who did that?" he'd asked. "Nobody touched me, Dad." "Sophie. I fell." He'd let it go. He didn't know why. He'd spent the next week hating himself for it. Tonight he was done letting things go. He turned the truck north on Route 9 past the tree line, past the volunteer fire station, with its single yellow light burning past the shuttered diner where he used to take Sophie for pancakes after church when she was 9 years old, and the world was something he could still make sense of. "Where are we going?" Sophie asked. He didn't answer right away. "Dad, I'm thinking." "You've been thinking since we left the motel. We've been driving for 40 minutes. "I know how long we've been driving." She shifted in her seat. Outside the window, nothing but dark road and darker tree line. The kind of rural stretch where you could disappear if you weren't careful, and disappear even faster if someone wanted you to. "There's a place," Richard said finally. Sophie looked at him. "What kind of place?" He tightened his hands on the wheel. "The kind that doesn't ask questions and doesn't answer them either." She was quiet for a long moment. Then, "Dad, are you taking me to a biker bar?" "It's a clubhouse." "That's worse." "It's safer." For who? He didn't answer that either because the honest answer was that he wasn't entirely sure. He had heard about the Hells Angels chapter outside of Millhaven 3 years ago from a guy on one of his crews, a big quiet man named Pete Donahue, who had a patch on his riding jacket that he never explained, and a way of ending conversations that made you feel like you'd just been politely dismissed by someone who could also break your arm. Pete didn't talk about the club much, but once during a long lunch break when the rain had grounded the entire crew for 2 hours, he'd said something that had stuck. "People think we're the ones to be afraid of," Pete had said, staring into his coffee. "People got it backwards. Half the time, we're the last ones standing between somebody and something worse." Richard had filed that away the way you file away things you don't think you'll ever need. He'd been wrong about that. He turned off the highway onto an unmarked county road. His headlights swept over a gravel lot, a chain-link fence, a metal building with a hand-painted sign he could barely read. The lights inside were on. Low amber colored, the kind of light that means people are awake who have no particular reason to be. "This is it," he said. Sophie stared through the windshield. "This is where you're bringing me." "Yes." "Dad, I know what it looks like. It looks like we're about to get murdered." "We're not getting murdered." "You don't know that." "Sophie." He turned to look at her, really look at her. She had her mother's eyes, sharp and green, and full of more intelligence than any room she'd ever walked into had been prepared for. Right now, those eyes were scared, and Richard felt that fear like a physical pressure against his sternum, but underneath it, he felt something harder. Anger. The kind that doesn't burn hot, but sits cold and permanent. The kind that belongs to a father watching his child run out of safe places to land. "We've been to the police," he said. "Twice. They took a report the first time and lost the file the second time. We've talked to 2 lawyers. One stopped returning calls after 3 days. One told you to keep quiet and consider whether your job was really worth all this. You had a journalist, a good one, and she went silent after somebody called her editor. You've been followed. Your apartment was broken into and nothing was stolen except the one external hard drive you'd left on your desk." He let that sit for a second. "Tell me I'm wrong," he said. Sophie said nothing. "Tell me we have somewhere else to go tonight that is safer than a locked building full of men who have survived things that would have killed most people." She looked at the building. She looked at her father. She did the math that only people with no good options left can do, not calculating best outcomes, but least bad ones. "If we die here," she said, "I'm going to be really annoyed at you." "Noted," Richard said and opened the truck door. The gravel was loud under his boots. Richard had not thought about what he was going to say until he was 10 steps from the door, and then he thought about it very quickly and realized that the only thing he had was the truth. He'd spent decades in a trade that didn't tolerate lying, not because people were noble, but because when you lied about a load calculation or a concrete pour, people died. He understood honesty as a form of structural engineering. Tonight, that was all he had. He knocked. 3 times, not timid, not aggressive. The knock of a man who is not sure he is welcome, but is certain he has the right to be heard. Nothing. He knocked again. Footsteps. Heavy, unhurried, the footsteps of someone who answers their own door on their own timeline and is not particularly concerned with yours. The door opened. The man in the doorway was enormous. Not in the fat way or even the gym way, but in the way that some men simply are like. They were built differently at a cellular level, like their bones are wider and their shoulders were designed with more surface area than the average human requires. He was probably 50, maybe older, with a gray beard that reached his collarbone and arms that were covered elbow to wrist in ink, so dense it had stopped looking like individual tattoos and started looking like armor. He was wearing a black sleeveless leather vest. On the back, the white and red patches of the Hells Angels MC were unmistakable, even from the front visible, as the man shifted slightly to the left. He looked at Richard without expression. Richard looked back. "I'm sorry to knock this late," Richard said. The man said nothing. "My name is Richard Miller. I'm a construction foreman from Allegheny County. I'm not a cop. I'm not a Fed. I don't have any interest in anything inside this building except one thing." The man still said nothing. His eyes moved once briefly to the truck behind Richard, to the shape visible in the passenger seat. "That's my daughter," Richard said, "and she's 22. She found out something she wasn't supposed to find out about the company she worked for. She reported it. Since then, her apartment was broken into. She's been followed, and tonight, there were 2 black SUVs parked outside the motel we were staying at, and they were not there for anyone else." He stopped, took one breath. "I've been everywhere else. I've run out of everywhere else. I don't need your help, but my daughter does. Can you hide her for one night?" The man in the doorway studied him. The kind of study that happens mostly behind the eyes, not reading the face, but reading something underneath it, something about whether the story holds, whether the desperation is real, whether the man doing the asking is the kind who can be trusted with a yes. It lasted about 8 seconds. Then the man stepped back from the door. "Get her," he said. "Both of you, inside." Richard exhaled for what felt like the first time in 3 hours. He turned and walked back to the truck. Sophie got out without him saying a word. She had been watching through the windshield. She had seen enough. She grabbed the canvas bag. She grabbed the folder that had been wedged between the seat and the center console, accordion-style fat, with paper rubber banded twice. She tucked it under her arm like it was a child. They walked to the door together. The man held it open. Inside, the air was warm and smelled like coffee and motor oil, and something vaguely like a bar, but not quite. There were maybe 8 men in the main room, some at a long table, some near the back. All of them looked up when Richard and Sophie came through the door, and the looking was not hostile, but it was not casual either. It was assessment, the rapid, practiced kind. The big man closed the door behind them. Grizz, one of the men at the table, said. The big man Grizz raised one hand slightly, a gesture that apparently meant stand down, because the man at the table went quiet. Grizz looked at Sophie. You hurt? He asked. Sophie blinked. Of all the things she had expected the first man to say, that was not it. No, she said, not physically. He nodded like that meant something specific to him. Sit down. You want coffee? She looked at her father. Her father looked at her. Yes, she said, please. A man near the coffee machine, younger, maybe 35, with a red bandana around his wrist, and a face that looked like it had been rearranged at least once, poured 2 cups without being asked. Grizz pulled a chair from the table and turned it backwards, sitting across from Richard and Sophie with his arms folded across the top of the chair back. Tell me, he said. Richard started to answer. Sophie put her hand on her father's arm. I'll tell it, she said. She had been hired at Crestfield Partners 19 months ago. She said it flat, without preamble, the way you say things when you have already told the story so many times that the emotion has worn a groove around it, and you can now speak from beside the groove rather than inside it. Crestfield Partners was a real estate and investment firm with offices in Pittsburgh and D.C., and a portfolio that looked on paper like every other mid-sized real estate fund, land acquisitions, development deals, commercial property management. Clean, ordinary, the kind of thing that generates absolutely no attention because it is designed to generate absolutely no attention. Sophie had been hired as a junior financial analyst. Her job was to reconcile transaction records, track fund flows, verify that the numbers on the left side of the ledger matched the numbers on the right. They did not match, not by accident, not by rounding errors or clerical mistakes, by design. There were shell companies, Sophie said, 12 of them that I found, probably more that I didn't. LLCs registered in Delaware and Wyoming with no employees, no offices, no websites. They existed only on paper, only to receive money and move it somewhere else. And the money was coming from real deals, legitimate land transactions. But on its way to the final destination, it was stopping off in these shells and losing a significant percentage every time. Where was the money going? Grizz asked. I don't know the full chain. I know some of it. I know 3 of the shells had the same registered agent, a law firm in Northern Virginia that handles about 40 other similar shells for about 8 different clients. I know that at least 2 of the land deals that were generating the original revenue were fake. The land existed, the transactions were recorded, but the counterparties on the other side were also shells, so you had money effectively going in a circle with a portion being siphoned off at each revolution. The room was very quiet. How much? Richard asked. That I could document 18 months of records, conservative calculation, roughly $37 million. Nobody moved. That's the amount I could document, Sophie said. I think the actual figure is larger. I think this has been running for longer than I had access to. Grizz looked at her steadily. And you reported it? To my supervisor, who went to HR, who suspended me the next day for unauthorized access to restricted financial records. I had not accessed anything restricted. I had been assigned those records. She paused. 3 days after the suspension, I was terminated. And then the other stuff started, Grizz said. Within a week, my apartment was broken into, nothing taken except one hard drive. I had a meeting with a journalist at the Pittsburgh Tribune, a good one. She'd broken 2 major stories in the last year. She went dark after the second email. Then I found out somebody had called her editor. I don't know what was said. And tonight, Grizz said, we were at a motel outside Canonsburg. 2 SUVs in the lot, neither one registered in the area. Both arrived within 20 minutes of us checking in. My father, she stopped, looked at Richard. Something moved across her face that she didn't let finish. My father decided we needed to leave. I decided it wasn't a coincidence, Richard said. It wasn't, said one of the men at the table, a lean, weathered man with silver at his temples and eyes that moved like they were doing calculations he didn't share. 2 SUVs on a cold motel lot at midnight isn't surveillance. That's a pickup crew. The room shifted, not physically, but something in the air changed. Something that had been wait and see moved into something else. Grizz stood up slowly, the kind of slow that had nothing to do with difficulty and everything to do with the fact that he was a man who did not rush because he had decided he was done rushing through things. Hawk, he said to the silver-templed man, take a walk outside. Back road fence line. You know what to look for. Hawk was already moving before Grizz finished the sentence. Tommy, oh, Grizz said to the younger man with the red bandana. Back door camera. On it. He looked at a third man, older heavy, sitting at the far end of the table with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched. Dutch, you want to take a look at what she brought? Dutch looked at Sophie. Sophie looked at Dutch. What are you? She asked. Dutch's expression didn't change. Semi-retired accountant. Sophie almost laughed. The almost laugh was genuine enough that it changed her face for a second, made her look 22 instead of 42. Seriously, 22 years with a regional firm in Cleveland. Did a lot of LLC work, actually. Sophie set the accordion folder on the table. Dutch reaches for it. You can look at the summary documents, Sophie said. Pages 1 through 14, don't touch the rest. Dutch looked at her. Then he almost smiled. Fair enough. He opened the folder. For a long moment, there was no sound except the turn of pages and the distant creak of the building and a sound from somewhere outside that might have been wind or might have been something else. Then Dutch looked up. He looked at Grizz. Grizz looked back. Dutch said, this is real, Zero. Richard felt Sophie's hand find his under the table. She had not done that since she was maybe 10 years old, a kid reaching for her father at the doctor's office. He held on. What happens now? He asked Grizz. Grizz looked at him across the table. Behind him, the clubhouse was moving with a quiet purpose. Men repositioning, doing things that had a practiced quality to them. The quality of people who have run a drill enough times that it doesn't look like a drill anymore. For tonight, Grizz said, you stay here. Both of you. We don't want to cause problems for... I didn't ask what you wanted. Richard stopped. Grizz leaned forward slightly. His voice did not get louder. It got quieter, which was somehow more significant. You knocked on this door at midnight. You told the truth. You brought me something real. He glanced at Sophie. She brought me something real. We have a rule here. You don't turn someone away at midnight. You understand that... Richard looked at the man, at the hard lines of his face and the weight that lived behind his eyes. Not cruelty, not indifference, but something that had been forged by things Richard couldn't see and probably wouldn't understand. And yet, yeah, Richard said, I understand. Then stop arguing with me. From outside came a knock, 3 quick raps on the back door. Tommy's voice through the wall. Fence lines clean, back roads clear. Hawk came back through the front 30 seconds later, stamping gravel off his boots. One vehicle, County Road North End, cold engine lights off, parked long enough that the exhaust had stopped. How far? Grizz asked. Half mile. Grizz nodded like he'd expected something in that range. He looked at Sophie. You said your apartment was broken into and the hard drive was taken. Yes. Was the hard drive what they were looking for? Sophie met his eyes, and something passed across her expression, not quite hesitation, but the cousin of hesitation. The moment before a person decides whether to play their full hand. She looked at the folder. She looked at her father. She looked at the canvas bag sitting on the chair beside her. No, she said. The room got very quiet. The hard drive was not what they were looking for, she said. It was what I wanted them to think they were looking for. Dutch slowly set down the document he was holding. Hawk stood very still near the door. Grizz looked at her for a long time. Go on, he said. Sophie reached into the canvas bag. She did not pull out the laptop yet. She pulled out something smaller, a folded piece of paper, handwritten, that she placed on the table in front of Grizz without unfolding it. Before I tell you the rest, she said, I need to know something. Ask, Grizz said. Why did you open the door? The question hung in the air. Grizz looked at it. Then he looked at Richard. Something in his expression shifted so briefly that Richard nearly missed it. Not quite recognition, not quite memory, something older than both. Because somebody knocked, Grizz said simply. Sophie looked at him for a long time. Then she opened her laptop. And the second part of the night, the part that none of them had seen coming, began. Sophie opened the laptop and the screen came up, and for a moment nobody spoke. Not because they were waiting for her to say something, but because the room had shifted into a different kind of attention, the kind that happens when people who have seen a lot of things recognize that they are about to see something new. Dutch leaned forward from his end of the table. Hawk had moved away from the door, not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, but he was now 3 feet closer than he had been a minute ago. The other men in the room, the ones who had been doing things at the edges, repositioning, checking, had gone still. Grizz watched Sophie's hands on the keyboard. 4 months ago, Sophie said, I realized that no single copy of anything was going to survive. Every time I thought I had a secure backup, something happened. The drive went missing. A cloud account got suspended. A lawyer suddenly wasn't available. It wasn't bad luck. It was a pattern. Somebody was watching your moves, Grizz said. Somebody was anticipating my moves. That's different. Watching means they were reacting. Anticipating means they had access to my thinking before I acted on it. She looked up from the screen, which means there was either someone in my circle talking or someone inside my devices. Or both, Hawk said from behind Grizz's left shoulder. Or both, Sophie agreed. So I stopped thinking about how to protect one copy of the evidence. I started thinking about how to make the evidence impossible to kill. She turned the laptop slightly so the table could see the screen. What was on it looked to Richard like a spreadsheet, crossed with a map, crossed with something from a science fiction film, colored nodes connected by lines, dozens of them with timestamps and file labels he couldn't parse at this distance. Dutch could apparently parse them just fine because he said quietly, You split it. I split everything, Sophie said. Every document, every transaction record, every shell company filing, every email I could legally document, I broke it into encrypted fragments. Each fragment is meaningless alone. Each fragment is stored in a different location. Some of those locations are physical, some are digital, some are with people, some are automated. What kind of people? Grizz asked. People who don't know they have it, Sophie said. The room went very, very still. Richard stared at his daughter. What does that mean? He asked. She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts apology and exhaustion. It means I took pieces of encrypted data fragments that look like corrupted image files or partial system logs or noise, and I embedded them in publicly accessible spaces. Online archives, open source repositories, a few private servers belonging to people who run legitimate cloud storage operations and wouldn't recognize a fragment of encrypted financial data if it was sitting in their downloads folder, which it is. Several of them, actually. Dutch made a sound that was not quite a laugh. That's insane, he said. That's distributed backup. That's insane distributed backup. It's both things, Sophie said, and for 1 second she almost sounded like a 22-year-old who was proud of something she'd built. Then the second passed and she looked like what she actually was, someone who had been running for 3 months on 4 hours of sleep and the specific adrenaline that belongs to people who understand exactly how much danger they're in. So when they took the hard drive, Grizz said slowly, they got a drive full of real-looking files that were constructed specifically to look like what they were looking for. Transaction records, analyst notes, partial shell company data, convincing enough that it would take them at least 2 weeks to verify it was incomplete, maybe longer if they're careful. And in 2 weeks, Grizz said, Sophie closed the laptop slightly. In 2 weeks, none of this matters because either the real evidence goes out through the release package I've already built, or it doesn't. But it won't be because someone took a hard drive. Hawk said, you planned for them to break in. I planned for the possibility. I didn't plan for it to happen while I was still trying to figure out the last piece. What's the last piece? Grizz asked. Sophie didn't answer immediately. And in that pause, that 3-second pause, while a 22-year-old woman sitting in a biker clubhouse at 2 a.m. decided how much of the truth she could afford to tell Richard, understood something that hit him like a physical blow. His daughter was not hiding. His daughter was fighting, had been fighting alone for months, had built something in the dark that he hadn't known existed, hadn't been allowed to know existed, and was still building it tonight, even with a surveillance vehicle parked half a mile up the county road and a folder full of fraud documentation sitting open on the table in front of a retired accountant who kept turning pages with the expression of a man finding bodies in a basement. He had come here to hide her. She had not come here to hide. He didn't know how to hold both of those things at once. The last piece, Sophie said finally, is identity. I know the fraud. I can prove the money moved. What I cannot yet prove, not to the standard that survives a federal filing, is who gave the original order. Who designed this? Who is at the top of the structure that generated those 12 shells and has been siphoning $37 million minimum out of what looked like clean land deals. You don't know who's running it, Grizz said. I know who I think is running it, she said. That's not the same thing. Dutch looked up from the folder. Who do you think is running it? Sophie looked at the table. Her jaw tightened in a way that Richard recognized. It was the same thing her face did when she was 9 years old, and trying not to cry in front of people she didn't know well enough to cry in front of. Robert Calloway, she said, Senior Managing Director of Crestfield Partners. He's been with the firm for 18 years. He hired me. Nobody said anything. He was my mentor, Sophie said. He's the one who told me I had a gift for seeing patterns in financial data. He's the one who put me on the reconciliation desk. He's the one who, she stopped, started again. He wrote me a recommendation letter for my graduate program application. It's framed in my apartment, or it was. Richard put his hand on the table, not touching her, just putting it there. You think he put you on that desk because he knew you'd find it? Grizz asked. No, Sophie said. I think he put me on that desk because he thought I wouldn't. I think he thought I was good enough to catch accidental errors, but not good enough to catch intentional ones. I think he miscalculated. Hawk said from behind Grizz, and when you found it, he had to clean up his own mistake. Hiring me, Sophie said. Yes. The silence that followed was heavy in a way that had nothing to do with danger. It had to do with betrayal, the specific weight of it, the way it lands differently when it comes from someone who chose you, who saw something in you and named it, who handed you a future that turned out to be a trap, laid by someone who thought you were almost smart enough, but not quite. Richard looked at his daughter and felt a rage so complete and so cold that it was almost peaceful. Grizz stood and walked to the back of the room. He did not make it into a statement. He just stood with his back to the table for a moment, and then he turned around. Dutch, he said, what are you looking at? Dutch had been quiet for 4 minutes. That was the longest Dutch had been quiet since Richard had walked through the door. Dutch was the kind of man who communicated constantly through small sounds, grunts, exhales, the rustle of paper, and 4 minutes of nothing from Dutch meant something. 6 of these shell companies, Dutch said, have the same signature structure, same Delaware filing agent, same capital contribution pattern, same distribution schedule. It's like a template. Whoever built the first one built them all. He turned a page. This is not work you hire out. Somebody understood exactly what they were building. Calloway, Grizz asked. Or someone Calloway trusts completely. The kind of trust you only give to someone who's already implicated. Someone who can't talk without going down with you. Sophie said, there's a man named Gerald Fitch. He's listed as Crestfield's in-house legal counsel. He's been with the firm almost as long as Calloway. He's the registered agent for 3 of the shells through a subsidiary of his private practice. Dutch turned pages, stopped. Page 11. Page 11, Sophie said. Dutch held up the document. This right here is a problem for Gerald Fitch. It's a bigger problem for Calloway, Sophie said. Fitch is implementation. Calloway is authorization. You can follow the money to Fitch all day. The decision to build the structure came from above him. Can you prove that? Grizz asked. I have emails, Sophie said, partial, fragments that survived because they were CC'd to distribution lists I could access through my analyst login before the suspension. They're not smoking guns, but they established that Calloway was directing the quarterly review of the shell transactions. He knew he wasn't just aware he was overseeing. Hawk said that's not enough to convict him. It's enough to open a federal investigation, Sophie said. And once that investigation opens, they have subpoena power I don't have. They can go places I can't go. They can compel testimony I can't compel. She looked at Grizz. I don't need to put Robert Calloway in prison myself. I need to give the right people enough to do it with. Grizz looked at her for a long moment. And the release package you built goes to 3 journalists of Federal Fraud Oversight Unit and 2 congressional staffers who have been working on financial transparency legislation and who, according to public record, have been looking for a case study that demonstrates exactly this kind of land transaction fraud. She paused. I chose carefully. Why hasn't it gone out yet? Grizz asked. Sophie's expression shifted. This was the question, the one that everything else had been circling. Because I'm missing something, she said. I have the transactions. I have the shell structures. I have the emails that establish Calloway's oversight. What I don't have is the endpoint where the money goes after it exits the shells. I can show $37 million going in. I cannot yet show where it comes out the other side. Without that, Callaway's defense team argues that the shells were legitimate investment vehicles that performed below expectation, that the fund losses were business risk, not fraud. They muddy the water. And if you find the endpoint, Grizz asked, if I find where the money lands, it collapses his entire defense. Because money doesn't vanish. It arrives somewhere. And if I can show where it arrives, I can show who benefits. And if I can show who benefits, there is no argument left. Dutch said slowly, do you have a lead on the endpoint? Sophie opened the laptop again. She pulled up a single document. Not a spreadsheet this time. A name and address, a corporate registration number. A holding company in the Cayman Islands, she said. Registered 8 years ago. Ownership structure is layered, but the beneficial owner at the deepest level. She stopped, turned the laptop to face Grizz. He looked at the screen. He read the name. He looked up at Sophie. Is this verified? He asked. The registration is verified. The link between Callaway and the beneficial owner of this company is what I'm still building. Grizz turned the laptop so Dutch could see it. Dutch looked at the name. He set down his coffee. He said nothing. Richard couldn't see the screen from where he was sitting. Who is it? He asked. Grizz looked at him. Someone who should not be involved in land deal fraud. Who? Hawk said it quietly from the back of the room, the way you say something out loud because the room needs to hear it, even if no one wants to be the one talking. State-level political money. Old money. The kind of name that's been in this state since before there were states. Richard absorbed that. So this isn't just a fraud case, he said. It hasn't been a fraud case since the first shell company, Sophie said. It's never been about money. Money's the mechanism. This is about power, about people who have always had it deciding that the rules that apply to everyone else simply don't apply to them. She closed the laptop. And they were right for a long time. They were right until somebody put a junior analyst on the reconciliation desk because they thought she wasn't quite smart enough to notice. The room was absolutely still. Then Dutch said from the end of the table in the voice of a man who has spent 22 years looking at numbers and can see the weight of what he's holding. Girl, this is the biggest thing I've ever had my hands on. And I did estate work for people whose names you'd recognize. Sophie looked at him. Dutch looked back. You need to finish it, he said. Not tomorrow, not next week. But you need to finish it because what's in this folder, what's not yet in this folder, is the difference between a story that disappears and one that doesn't. I know, Sophie said. How close are you? She looked at the canvas bag. She looked at the laptop. She looked at something that wasn't in the room. Some interior calculation that only she had access to, running numbers that had nothing to do with money. Days, she said. If I have a safe place to work. Days. Grizz turned to Richard. Richard had been quiet for a while. He'd been doing what fathers do when they finally understand the full shape of something, sitting with it, turning it, letting it settle into the architecture of what he already knew about his child. You're staying, Grizz said. It was not a question. Yes, Richard said. You understand this isn't a hotel. I understand. You understand that if those SUVs come back, things get complicated. I understand that too. Grizz studied him. Construction foreman. 31 years. What's the hardest thing you ever built? Richard thought about it. Not a long thought. The answer was immediate. Just a question of whether to say it. My daughter, he said. Grizz said nothing for a moment. Then he stood. Tommy, he called toward the back. Set up the side room, clean bedding, lock on the inside. He looked at Sophie. You work in there. Door stays locked when you want it locked. You come out when you want to come out. Nobody goes in without your say. Sophie stared at him. Why are you doing this? Grizz looked at her steadily. Because somebody knocked. That's the second time you've said that. It'll stop being true when it stops being the answer. She looked at him for another moment. Then she picked up the canvas bag and the laptop and she stood. She stopped. Grizz. Yeah, if this goes wrong, if something happens, nothing's going to happen tonight. But if it does, the laptop has a dead man's trigger. 72 hours without a specific key press sequence, and the release package goes out automatically. I set it up 6 weeks ago. It's not theoretical. Grizz absorbed that. So even if they get to you, he said, it goes out. Everything goes out. They can't stop it. It's already in motion, has been for 6 weeks. All they can do is decide whether it goes out while I'm alive and able to provide context, or whether it goes out after something happens to me and becomes the biggest unexplained whistleblower death in the state of Pennsylvania. Hawk said quietly, she built herself a dead man's switch. I built myself a reason for them to keep me alive, Sophie corrected. She looked at Grizz. They don't know about it yet, but if they find out, then you become more valuable breathing than not, Grizz said. Yes. And you're telling me this because you need to know what you're protecting, she said. You need to know that this isn't just a scared kid who stumbled onto something. This is a structure, a plan, and it's running right now, tonight, even here. She held his gaze. I'm not asking you to save me. I'm asking you to give me 4 days. 4 days and a locked door and people who won't tell Calloway where I am. Grizz looked at her for a long time. 4 days, he said. Thank you. She walked toward the side room. At the doorway, she stopped, turned back. The man you saw in the truck, she said. My father. Yeah. He didn't know about the dead man's switch. He didn't know about the distributed backup. He didn't know about any of it. He's been driving me around for 3 days because I told him I needed help, and he didn't ask for an explanation. He just got in the truck. She looked at Richard. Richard looked back at her. I need you to know that, she said. He came here in the dark because he trusts me. Not because he understood the situation, because he trusts me. She went through the door. Tommy closed it behind her. The sound of the lock engaging from the inside came a moment later. Richard sat at the table alone for a moment. Dutch had gone back to the folder. Hawk had drifted toward the far wall with a phone in his hand doing something quiet and deliberate. The other men had redistributed through the building with the easy efficiency of people who have had complicated nights before and know how to be useful inside them. Grizz sat back down across from Richard. When did you know, Grizz asked, that it was serious? Richard thought about the bruise. He thought about the hard drive. He thought about the morning 3 weeks ago when he picked up Sophie's phone by accident and seen a text from an unknown number that said, only stop. One more step and it isn't just you. About 3 weeks ago, he said, I should have known sooner. People don't know sooner, Grizz said. Sooner is always the hardest one to see. Richard looked at him. Do you have kids? Grizz was quiet for a moment. I had a daughter, he said, past tense. Richard didn't ask, Grizz didn't say. Some things in a conversation open a door, and both people understand immediately that neither one of them is going to walk through it tonight, and they move on. She's going to be okay, Grizz said. You can't know that, Richard said. No, Grizz agreed, but I've seen people who are going to fall apart and people who are going to hold. She's going to hold. Richard looked at the locked door at the end of the room. She built a dead man's switch, he said. It came out slightly hollow. My daughter, 22 years old. She built I don't even fully understand what that is. It means she thought further ahead than they did, Grizz said. That's what she built. Distance between herself and the moment they could stop her. She was alone when she built it, Richard said. Yes. I was 20 minutes away. Whole time. Working a job site in Allegheny County, going home watching television while my kid was... He stopped. Grizz waited. I should have been there, Richard said. You're here now, Grizz said. It was not a consolation. It was a fact. The specific kind of fact that doesn't make anything better but prevents things from getting worse. And Grizz said it the way a man says things when he knows the difference between those two outcomes. Richard nodded. Outside somewhere on the county road, a car engine turned over. Both men heard it. Grizz's head came up slightly. Hawk was already at the window, not looking through it, standing beside it, which was different. Moving, Hawk said, going north. They listened. The sound faded. The silence came back. One of them, Grizz said. One of them, Hawk confirmed. Not both. Richard looked at Grizz. What does that mean? Grizz looked at the door behind which Sophie was working. The glow of a laptop screen visible in the gap at the bottom, steady and blue and unbroken. It means one of them left, he said, and one of them didn't. The room settled into a different kind of quiet after that. Not the quiet of safety, The quiet of people who understand exactly what they are sitting inside and have decided to sit in it anyway. Dutch turned a page. The laptop glow under the door did not waver. And somewhere on a county road in rural Pennsylvania in the dark, in the cold, something that had been waiting decided to wait a little longer. Dutch was still at the table at 4 in the morning. He had stopped turning pages. He was now writing a legal pad he'd pulled from somewhere, filling it with the small, precise handwriting of a man who had spent 2 decades reducing complicated things to their simplest numbers. He didn't look up when Grizz came back into the room. He didn't look up when Tommy set a fresh pot of coffee on the table. He wrote, and occasionally he turned back 2 or 3 pages in the folder to check something, and then he wrote again. Richard had fallen asleep in the chair against the wall. Not deeply, the kind of sleep that happens when a body simply overrides what the mind wants, taking 20 minutes of unconsciousness, like a forced withdrawal from an account that's been overdrawn for days. His head had dropped sideways. His hands were still on his knees. Grizz looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at the glow under the locked door. It was still there, still blue, still steady. Sophie had not slept. Hawk came in from outside, rubbing his hands together against the cold and caught Grizz's eye and gave a small shake of his head. Still one vehicle, still not moving, still waiting with the specific patience of people who are paid to wait and have done it before and understand that patience is its own kind of pressure. They're not coming in tonight, Hawk said quietly. No, Grizz said. So what's tonight for? Tonight's for knowing we're here, Grizz said. So tomorrow we know they know. Hawk thought about that. And tomorrow we find out who sent them. Dutch said without looking up from the legal pad. I might already know. Both men looked at him. Dutch finished the line he was writing, set the pen down, turned the legal pad so it faced across the table. 3 of these shell companies, he said. The Delaware filings use a registered agent out of Wilmington, completely standard. But 2 of the 3 list the same person as the initial organizer, the individual who signed the formation documents. Not Fitch, not a name I recognize from anything in this folder. Grizz sat down. Who? Dutch pointed to a name on the legal pad. Martin Weil, he said. He's not in Crestfield's org chart. He's not listed anywhere in Sophie's documents. But I've seen this name before. He paused. 8 years ago, I had a client, small manufacturing firm, looking to restructure. They brought in an outside consultant to set up their holding structure. Same signature pattern, same Delaware agent, same capital contribution timing. He tapped the legal pad. Martin Weil. You're saying this person builds these structures professionally, Grizz said. I'm saying Martin Weil is an architect. You hire him when you want a financial structure that is specifically designed to survive scrutiny. He doesn't appear in the documents. He doesn't appear in the company. He leaves no footprint except the formation signature, which is technically required by law and which most people never look at because it's on page 4 of a public filing that nobody reads. Dutch looked at Grizz. Somebody needs to ask Sophie if she found this name anywhere. Grizz stood, walked to the locked door, knocked twice. A pause. Yeah, Sophie's voice from inside. Name, Martin Weil, means anything, A longer pause, then the sound of keystrokes stopping. Then where did you get that name? Grizz looked back at Dutch. Dutch pulled it from the formation documents. Another pause. Longer this time. The kind of pause that is full of a person rearranging things rapidly inside their head. Open the door, Sophie said. The lock disengaged. The door opened. Sophie stood in the doorway with her laptop under one arm and her eyes with the particular brightness of someone who has been awake so long that their brain has crossed back over into a strange second alertness. Her hair was pushed back on one side where she'd had her hand against her head while she was reading. She looked at the legal pad. She looked at Dutch. Martin Weil, she said, I have that name. I have it in one place buried in a footnote in an email thread that Calloway copied me on by accident 4 months before I found the fraud. It was a scheduling note, a dinner reservation. Calloway's assistant confirming a table for 3 Calloway, Fitch, and Weil. She set the laptop on the table. I didn't know who he was. I flagged it and didn't know what I was flagging. I thought he was a client. He's not a client, Dutch said. He's the person who built the structure you've been documenting. He's the craftsman. Calloway's the owner. Fitch is the manager. But the thing they've been running was designed by Weil. Sophie stared at the legal pad. If I can connect Weil to the current shell structure, she said slowly, and connect Weil to Calloway through that dinner, through documented contact between the architect and the principal before the structures were built. That's conspiracy, Dutch said flatly. That's not just fraud anymore. That's a coordinated, premeditated conspiracy to commit wire fraud and money laundering. Sophie sat down. She sat down hard, the way people sit when their legs make the decision independently of their brain. That's the piece, she said. That's the piece I've been missing. I've been trying to find the end point where the money lands. But what I actually needed was the beginning. Who designed it and when? Richard had woken up. Nobody had noticed. He was sitting against the wall with his eyes open, listening, saying nothing. Can you get Weil's formation signature matched to the shell companies you've already documented? Dutch asked. The formation documents are public record, Sophie said. If Weil signed in the formation paperwork for any of the shells I've already identified, then yes, I can pull them tonight. Do it, Dutch said. She was already opening the laptop. The next hour was the quietest the clubhouse had been since Richard and Sophie had walked through the door. Dutch worked from the folder. Sophie worked from the laptop. The two of them moved in a kind of parallel silence, occasionally asking each other questions, Dutch reading off a company name, Sophie pulling its formation record, Sophie noting a date, Dutch cross-referencing it against a transaction timeline, with the efficient shorthand of two people who have both spent years reading financial documents and understand how to speak the language of numbers to each other without explanation. Hawk watched the window. Tommy refilled coffee without being asked. Grizz sat and did what he was best at, which was being still. Richard watched his daughter work. He had watched her as a child. He had watched her take apart a broken clock at age 8 and put it back together with 3 extra pieces that she said were redundant, with an accuracy that a watchmaker would have recognized. He had watched her at 12 teaching herself algebra from a library book because the school was moving too slowly. He had watched her at 17 winning a state mathematics competition and then immediately asking her team coach what the next harder problem was. He had not watched her like this, like someone who had built a weapon in secret and was now loading it in front of him for the first time. He was proud of her in a way that had no adequate language. And underneath the pride was something else, a grief that he didn't fully understand yet, that had something to do with the distance between the daughter he thought he knew and the person she had apparently been becoming while he was 20 minutes away, not paying close enough attention. At 5:17 in the morning, Sophie said, I have it. Dutch looked up. Martin Weil signed the formation documents for 4 of the 12 shell companies. 4 of the ones I've already fully documented. His signature is on the public filings. He used the same registered agent in all 4 cases. And the formation dates. She turned the laptop. 3 of the 4 were formed within 60 days of the dinner reservation where Calloway, Fitch, and Weil all sat at the same table. Dutch looked at the screen. He looked at his legal pad. He did the calculation that only takes a second when you already know what you're looking at. That's the conspiracy, he said. Right there, documented, timeline holds. Sophie exhaled. It was not a breath of relief. It was the breath of a person who has been holding something for a very long time and has finally found the place to set it down. I need to rebuild the release package, she said. Add this layer, reorder the narrative so the conspiracy framing comes first, so any journalist or federal investigator who opens it understands within the first 2 pages what they're looking at and why it matters. How long? Dutch asked. 2 hours, maybe 3. Dutch nodded. He pushed back from the table. He was 61 years old and had been awake all night, and he moved like someone who had done that before and knew which parts of himself to be careful with. He stood. He looked at Sophie. You built something good, and he said, I want you to know that. What you put together here by yourself with no legal authority, no subpoena power, no forensic accountant, what you built is better than half the fraud cases I've seen assembled by people with full institutional support. He picked up his coffee. Finish it right. Sophie looked at him. Thank you. Dutch went to find somewhere to sit that wasn't a wooden chair. It was Richard who heard it first. He didn't know why. He wasn't watching the window. He wasn't positioned near the door. He was sitting against the wall with a cup of cold coffee and his eyes halfway closed when something moved through the room, not a sound, exactly more like the absence of the right sound, A skip in the rhythm of the night that his construction foreman's instincts, trained over 30 years to notice structural anomalies, flagged before his conscious brain caught up. He sat up straight. "Grizz," he said. Grizz looked at him. "Something's wrong," Richard said. Grizz was already turning toward Hawk. Hawk had his phone out. He was looking at something on the screen, the back camera feed. Richard realized. His face had changed. "The storage unit," Hawk said. Richard didn't understand the reference immediately. Sophie understood it. She was on her feet before Hawk finished the sentence. "What storage unit?" Grizz said. "Off Route 9, north end of Bridgeton. I have a unit there." Sophie's voice had gone very flat, very controlled. The flatness of someone managing something they cannot afford to feel yet. "I moved physical documents there 3 weeks ago. Hard copies, originals." Hawk turned his phone so Grizz could see. Grizz looked at the screen. Richard watched Grizz's face. Grizz's face did not change much. It almost never did. But something moved through his eyes, something that was not quite anger and not quite surprise, but was close to both of them. "It's burning," Hawk said. The words landed in the room like something dropped from a height. Sophie stood completely still. "Sophie," Richard said. She didn't answer. "Sophie. The originals," she said, not to him, to herself. 18 months of physical originals. Print copies of the emails. Hard copy bank records that I pulled before they locked my login. The original reconciliation sheets with my handwritten margin notes." She stopped. "Those were the documents that could not be recreated digitally. If something in the digital chain got challenged in court, if a defense attorney argued that the digital files were manipulated, those originals were the authentication layer." "Gone," Hawk said quietly. "Gone," Sophie repeated. Richard stood up. He crossed the room to his daughter. He did not put his arms around her. He stood beside her close enough that she could feel him there, which was different from a hug, which is what people do when they need comfort. He stood beside her like a wall stands beside something, not to hold it up, but to be there when it needs something to lean against. Sophie did not lean. She stood, and she thought. The room waited. Grizz waited. Richard waited. Sophie's jaw tightened. Her eyes moved, not looking at anything in the room, looking at something internal, something she was calculating. Then she said, "Okay, just that. Okay." Richard looked at her. "Okay," he said. "The storage unit burning is bad," she said. "It's not fatal." She looked at Grizz. "The originals are gone, but I photographed every original document before I moved it to that unit. High resolution. Metadata preserved. The photographs are in the distributed backup, fragmented, encrypted, distributed across 11 separate locations." She paused. "They burned the documents. The images of the documents still exist." Hawk said, "They don't know about the distributed backup." "No," Sophie said. "They think they just eliminated my authentication layer. They think they won." She looked at her laptop. "They didn't win. They just told me something." "What?" Grizz said. "They know about the storage unit, which means they've been watching me longer than I thought and more carefully than I thought. They know about physical evidence locations." She looked up. "Which means someone inside the legal process, someone I talked to, a lawyer, a journalist, maybe law enforcement, was reporting my movements back to Callaway." The room absorbed that. "A leak," Grizz said. "A source," Sophie said. "They had a source in every institution I went to. That's why everything failed. That's why the police report got lost. That's why the journalist went quiet. That's why the lawyer stopped calling." She exhaled. "I thought I was running out of allies. I was actually being systematically stripped of them." Hawk said from the window. "The vehicle on the county road." Everyone looked at him. "It hasn't moved," he said. "All night, through the fire, it hasn't moved." Grizz understood immediately, because whoever is in it already knew the unit was burning. "They're not surveillance," Hawk said. "They're confirmation. They're parked out there to confirm we're here, confirm we haven't run, and report back." "Report back to who?" Richard asked. Grizz looked at him steadily. "Whoever decides what happens next." Sophie sat back down. She sat with her back straight and her hands flat on the table on either side of the laptop, the posture of someone who is refusing to let their body communicate what their mind is processing. "I need to change the timeline," she said. "How?" Dutch asked from the corner of the room. The release package was set for 72 hours. That was based on the assumption that I had time to finish the Cayman endpoint documentation and reorder the narrative. I don't have that time anymore. She looked at the screen. They know I have something. They know it's enough to act on, or they wouldn't have burned the unit, which means the window before they escalate from burning documents to other options is shorter than I planned for. How much shorter? Grizz asked. I don't know, maybe 24 hours? Maybe less. Then stop trying to complete it, Dutch said. Release what you have. What I have without the Cayman endpoint gives Callaway a defense. What you have without the Cayman endpoint still opens an investigation, Dutch said, and an open federal investigation is a problem they cannot burn down. Sophie looked at him. You send everything you have right now, Dutch said, leaning forward. You send the shells, the timelines, the wild connection, the emails, the transaction records, the photo documentation of every original you just lost in that fire. You send it all tonight before sunrise before they decide the next move. You let the investigators pull the Cayman thread themselves. That's what subpoenas are for. Sophie was quiet. You've been trying to deliver a complete case, Dutch said. You don't have to deliver a complete case. You have to deliver enough that the people with authority can complete it. Richard looked at his daughter. Sophie looked at her screen. If I send it now, she said slowly, it protects us. They can't escalate after the evidence is out. There's no point. There's no point, Dutch confirmed. But Callaway has time to move assets, time to get ahead of some of it. Some, Dutch said. Not all, not enough. Sophie's hands moved to the keyboard, then stopped. She looked at Grizz. If I send this from here, she said, from this location, they'll know. They already know you're here, Grizz said. They'll know you helped. I know that. That's a problem for you. After this is over, that's a problem for Callaway. Has connections. Political money. If he decides to make your life difficult, let me worry about my life, Grizz said. You worry about yours. Sophie held his gaze for a long moment. Why, she said. Seriously, why are you doing this? You don't know us. You don't owe us anything. You could have turned us away at the door and gone back to bed, and none of this would be your problem. Grizz was quiet, not because he didn't have an answer, because he was choosing which answer was the right one. Your father, he said finally. Tell me something. Is he the kind of man who stops on a highway when he sees someone hurt? Sophie looked at Richard. Richard looked at Grizz. What does that have to do with? Richard started. Is he? Grizz said. Richard said nothing. Something moved across his face, a recognition, the beginning of one. Like a word in a language you studied a long time ago, suddenly surfacing in a sentence you weren't expecting. 3 years ago, Grizz said, Highway 68, late October. A man went down on a Harley Softail in the rain, hit a patch of gravel on the off-ramp, went into the guardrail. He paused. There were 11 cars that passed before anyone stopped. Richard's hands had gone very still. One man pulled over, Grizz said. Blonde, 50s, drove a beat-up white pickup, called the ambulance, stayed until it arrived, held the rider's head still because the rider was trying to get up and was going to make it worse. He looked at Richard. The rider's name was Mason Carter. The room was absolutely silent. Richard stared at Grizz. Grizz looked back at him. Grizz looked back at... You were going to be late for a site inspection, Grizz said. You told me that. You said you were going to be late and you still pulled over. I remember because I was halfway conscious and mostly terrified, and the only thought I could hold on to was that somebody had stopped. After 11 cars that didn't. Richard's jaw worked. He said nothing. I never found out who you were, Grizz said. Paramedics came, you disappeared. I spent a year asking around and couldn't track you down. He looked at Sophie, and then your father knocked on my door at midnight. Sophie turned to Richard. Richard was looking at Grizz with an expression that had no good name. It was somewhere between recognition and grief, in something that might have been relief, the relief of understanding something that has been incomplete for a long time, some loose thread been finally finding the place it was always supposed to connect. I didn't know who you were, Richard said. I know. I couldn't drive past him. I know that too, Grizz said. Sophie looked at her father, then she looked at Grizz, then she looked at the room around her, at Dutch with his legal pad at Hawk, at the window at Tommy, with the coffee, at all of it. She turned back to her laptop. Her hands went to the keyboard. I'm sending it now, she said. All of it, Dutch asked. Everything I have. Every fragment, every document, every photograph, every transaction, record, every email, the wild connection, the timeline, all of it, right now, before sunrise. Her fingers moved. Grizz watched. Richard watched. The room watched. And then Sophie's hand stopped. She leaned forward. She read something on the screen that she had not been expecting to read. The color left her face. What? Richard said. He was on his feet. Sophie, what is it? She turned the laptop slowly. On the screen was an email, sent 47 minutes ago, while they had all been in this room while the storage unit was burning, while they were watching Hawk's phone and rearranging timelines and talking about dead man switches and distributed backups and what to send and when. The email was addressed to Sophie's personal account. The sender was Robert Calloway. The subject line read, I know where you are. And the body of the email, 4 sentences, clean and precise and written in the voice of a man who has not yet decided he has lost, said, Sophie, you've been thorough. More thorough than I expected, honestly. But you're in a building full of people who have more to lose from federal attention than they realize. And I think if you consider their situation carefully, you'll find that staying quiet is still the option that hurts the fewest people. Call me by 8 a.m. We can resolve this without anyone else getting hurt. Richard read it over her shoulder. He straightened up. His face had gone to the place it goes when he has looked at a structural failure and understood exactly what caused it and what it will cost to fix it, and the cost is high. He's threatening the club, Richard said. Grizz had already read it. His expression had not changed. But something in the room around him had something in the air, in the way the other men in the room had gone to a different kind of stillness. He thinks he can use us against you, Grizz said to Sophie. Flat, factual. Sophie looked at him. Send it, Grizz said. Grizz, send it now, he said. All of it, every piece. If he follows through on this, if he brings federal attention to this club, if he makes calls to people who have history with the Angels, your members, are people who have survived things that Robert Calloway has never imagined, Grizz said. His voice had not gotten louder. It had gotten quieter, which was the thing it did when he was most certain. To the evidence. Send everything. Do it right now. Sophie looked at him for one more second. Then she looked at her screen. She opened the release package. She added the Calloway email, the one that had arrived 47 minutes ago, the one that had been designed to frighten her into silence as the final attachment. Because a threat made in writing is not leverage, it is evidence. Her finger moved to the send key. She pressed it. The screen changed, sent it, said, sent to 3 journalists, a federal fraud oversight unit, 2 congressional staffers, and 1 additional address that Sophie had added to the list 6 weeks ago and never removed a contact she had not mentioned to anyone in this room, a name attached to an agency that she had spent 3 months deciding whether to trust. She stared at the screen. 43 separate recipients. The entire truth. Everything she had built in the dark alone for months. Gone out into the world in the time it takes to press 1 key. And now it was not hers anymore. It belonged to everyone. She closed the laptop. She sat back in her chair. The room breathed. Richard put his hand on her shoulder. She reached up and covered it with hers. Outside on the county road, the vehicle that had been sitting in the dark all night finally started its engine. And for the first time since midnight, it drove away. The silence after Sophie pressed send lasted maybe 30 seconds. Then Dutch said from the corner, where he had settled into a chair with his legal pad, it's done. Not a question, a statement, the kind a person makes when they need the room to hear the thing out loud so it becomes real. It's done, Sophie said. Richard did not move his hand from her shoulder. She did not move her hand from his. They stayed like that for a moment, father and daughter connected at that one point of contact, and everything that had been building since she showed up at his door 3 weeks ago, with a bruise on her jaw and a look in her eyes that said the world had gone wrong, somewhere settled into that handhold and rested there. Grizz stood. He walked to the window, not to look through it, to stand beside it to listen. The vehicle on the county road was gone. The sound of its engine had faded north and then disappeared, entirely swallowed by distance and dark and the particular silence of rural Pennsylvania at 5:40 in the morning. They know, Hawk said. The ones in the car know, Grizz said. Calloway knows within the hour. And then what? Tommy asked. He was young enough that the question was genuine, not rhetorical, not strategic. He actually wanted to know what happened when a man like Robert Calloway, senior managing director of a real estate investment firm with $37 million of fraudulent transactions in a Cayman holding company, and political connections old enough to have names on buildings, found out that the thing he had been trying to bury for 3 months had just been sent to 43 recipients simultaneously. Grizz turned from the window. Then we find out what kind of man he is. We already know what kind of man he is, Richard said. We know what he does through proxies, Grizz said. SUVs, phone calls to editors, break-ins. That's a man managing a problem at arm's length. What we don't know yet is what he does when arm's length stops working. The room considered that. Sophie looked at her closed laptop. She looked at the Calloway email still open in a separate tab in her memory, I know where you are, and she thought about the specific kind of mind that sends an email like that. Precise, controlled. A man who has not yet accepted that control is gone, who believes he can still negotiate a reality that suits him, because in his experience, reality has always been negotiable for people with enough leverage. He'll come here, she said. The room looked at her. In person, she said. That's what the email was setting up. He wanted me to call him by 8 a.m. because he wanted to know for certain I was still here. The SUVs were never going to take me. That would create exactly the kind of story he can't afford. He wanted to talk. He thinks he can still talk his way out of this. The evidence is already out, Dutch said. He doesn't know the full scope of what I sent, Sophie said. He knows I have documents. He doesn't know about the Weil connection. He doesn't know I have the conspiracy timeline. He thinks he's dealing with a junior analyst who found some suspicious transactions and got scared. She looked at Grizz. He's going to come here and try to buy control of the story. That's how he operates. That's how he's operated for 18 years. He finds the pressure point and he applies money to it. Grizz looked back at her steadily. And you want to let him? It was not a question. Sophie said, I want to record it. Done. The next 2 hours moved differently than the hours before them. Before the send, everything had been about building, accumulating, protecting, preparing. After the send, something shifted in the room's metabolism. The accumulation was over. What was left was consequence. Sophie spent 40 minutes at the laptop setting up recording software, audio and screen capture, routed through an encrypted tunnel to one of the distributed backup nodes live as it happened. She explained it to Grizz in 3 sentences. He listened without asking her to repeat anything. Dutch went through the folder one final time and organized the physical documents in the order a federal investigator would want to find them. He had done document organization for litigation support 3 times in his career, and his hands moved with the muscle memory of it, sorting without hesitation. Hawk made phone calls, short ones, the kind where you say a name and a location and a time frame, and the person on the other end says understood, and hangs up. Richard didn't ask who he was calling. The way Grizz didn't stop him was answer enough. Richard himself did something he had not done since they left the motel. He walked to the corner of the room farthest from the door, faced the wall, and was still for about 5 minutes. Tommy appeared at his elbow. You all right? Thinking, Richard said. About what? Richard turned to look at the boy. 25, maybe 26. The red bandana still around his wrist. A face that had been rearranged but was young enough that the rearrangement hadn't become a permanent part of his expression yet. I'm thinking about a man I've never met, Richard said. A man who hired my daughter because he thought she was almost good enough. And I'm thinking about what I want to say to him when he walks through that door. Tommy was quiet for a moment. What do you want to say? Nothing that would help Sophie, Richard said. Tommy nodded. He understood that. The specific discipline of a father who knows that what he wants and what serves his child are different things and has chosen at considerable personal cost to serve his child. Grizz will handle it, Tommy said. I know he will. You just have to let him. Richard looked across the room at Grizz, who was standing near the table with his arms crossed and his eyes on the door with the particular patience of a man who has waited out worse things than a corporate executive and won. I know, Richard said. At 7:53 in the morning, a car pulled into the gravel lot. Not an SUV, a car black clean, the kind of car that announces money without announcing itself. It pulled in slowly, parked close to the door. The engine shut off. Hawk was at the window. One person, he said. Driver's seat, sitting. Composing himself, Sophie said. How long? Grizz asked. Maybe 3 minutes, Sophie said. He doesn't rush anything. He never has. It was 2 minutes and 40 seconds. Then the car door opened. Then footsteps on gravel. Then a knock on the door. 3 times. Measured. The knock of a man who expects doors to open for him and has rarely been wrong. Grizz looked around the room. Dutch had moved to the far end of the table with the folder in front of him. Hawk had positioned himself against the back wall in a way that was technically casual and actually not. Tommy was near the coffee. Sophie was at the table laptop, open recording, running her face arranged into an expression of absolute calm that Richard recognized as something she had built for this specific moment and was wearing now the way a construction worker wears a hard hat, not comfortable but necessary. Richard was against the side wall. He had agreed to stay there. He had agreed to say nothing unless spoken to. He had agreed to let Grizz handle the opening. He had also decided privately that he would abide by that agreement right up until the moment it became impossible to abide by it. Grizz went to the door. He opened it. Robert Calloway was 61 years old and looked 54. That was the first thing Richard noticed, the way money and control maintained long enough produce a kind of preservation in a person. He was trim, silver-haired cut close. He wore a gray overcoat over a dark suit, and the suit was not expensive in a way that announced itself. It was expensive in the way that makes cheap things look cheap, by contrast. He looked at Grizz. Grizz looked at him. I'm looking for Sophie Miller, Calloway said. I know, Grizz said. A beat. Calloway had expected either a denial or an invitation. Grizz had given him neither. The gap sat there for a moment, and Calloway filled it the way he always filled gaps, by moving forward. May I come in? Grizz stepped back from the door. Calloway came in. He saw Sophie immediately. His eyes went to her with the specific precision of a man who has spent decades in rooms where information was currency and reading, who has what was the first order of business. He saw the laptop. He saw Dutch. He saw Richard against the wall, and he registered Richard with a slight flicker, a recalculation, and then he looked back at Sophie. Sophie, he said. His voice was warm. That was the thing Richard hadn't expected, the warmth. It was not performed warmth. It was the real warmth of a man who genuinely liked the person he was about to try to destroy. Mr. Calloway, Sophie said, you could have called, he said. You could have not built a 12-shell money laundering structure, she said. A pause. The warmth in his voice adjusted, not gone, but recalibrated. That's a significant accusation. It's in about 40 inboxes right now, Sophie said. So it's not really an accusation anymore. It's a description. Calloway looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the room, at Grizz, at Dutch, at the men positioned around the space, at Richard against the wall. He was reading threat levels. Richard could see him doing it. The man was not stupid. He understood immediately that he had walked into something more prepared than he'd expected. I'd like to speak with Sophie privately, he said. No, Grizz said. Calloway looked at him. I'm sorry, You're not speaking with her privately, Grizz said. You're speaking with her here in front of witnesses, or you're getting back in your car. Calloway studied Grizz the way people study things they have not accounted for and are rapidly reassessing. Then something in his posture shifted, a microscopic adjustment, the kind that happens when a negotiator abandons plan A and moves to plan B without announcing the transition. He sat down across from Sophie. He folded his hands on the table. I want to help you, he said. Sophie looked at him. I know that sounds... It sounds exactly like what it is, Sophie said. You're here because the evidence went out 2 hours ago and you need to know what I have before your lawyers do, and you're hoping you can offer me something that makes me want to tell you. Calloway was quiet for a beat. Then, what you sent, I don't know exactly what's in it, but I know you're a thorough analyst. I know you're good, better than good. He paused. I know you found things that would be difficult to explain. $37 million of fraudulent transactions, Sophie said. A 12-shell laundering structure designed by Martin Weil. Your documented coordination with Weil and Gerald Fitch in the 60 days before the first 3 shells were formed. The Cayman Holding Company and its beneficial ownership trail. She held his gaze. Difficult to explain is a generous framing. Something moved through Calloway's face. He controlled it faster than most people could. But Richard had been watching and he caught it. The thing that moved through Calloway's face when Sophie said Martin Weil was not guilt. It was fear. The specific fear of a man who has just understood that the person across from him knows more than he calculated. Martin Weil is a consultant, Calloway said. His involvement with our firm is documented through his formation signatures on 4 of the shells, his registered agent of record in Delaware, and the dinner reservation your assistant confirmed on September 14th, Sophie said, which I was copied on by accident, which you didn't know. Calloway's hands on the table were absolutely still. Gerald Fitch is going to have a very difficult conversation with federal investigators, Sophie said. Probably before noon today if the oversight unit I sent to responds at their typical speed. Calloway looked at her. She looked back. And in that exchange, Richard saw something he had not expected to see. He saw the moment a man understood that he had lost, not suspected it, not feared it, but understood it with the full clarity that comes when the last possible alternative has been eliminated. He saw it move through Calloway's face like a wave that starts deep and surfaces slowly, and he saw Calloway feel it, and then do the thing that men who have controlled rooms for 30 years do. When they feel the floor go out, he went still. Completely still. Not the stillness of a man in shock, but the stillness of a man who is buying himself time to find the next position. What do you want? Calloway said. Nothing from you, Sophie said. Everyone wants something. I wanted the truth to get to the people who could act on it, she said. That happened 2 hours ago. There's nothing left for me to want from you. There are things I can offer. Mr. Calloway, Sophie's voice was steady, you hired me because you thought I was smart enough to find more mistakes, but not smart enough to find your intentions. You were wrong about the second part, and everything that came from that, the suspension, the termination, the break-in, the surveillance, the burn storage unit. She stopped. One breath. The burn storage unit. I want you to sit with that for a second. You burned documents that included print copies of thank you notes I sent you, performance reviews you signed, quotes from mentorship meetings where you told me I had a future in this industry. She looked at him with an expression that was not hatred and not grief and not quite either, but occupied the specific territory between them where the most precise emotions live. You burned them along with everything else. Calloway said nothing. You didn't just commit fraud, Sophie said. You built something that used me as a component, as the person who was supposed to fail to notice. And when I didn't fail, you tried to erase me. She closed the laptop. The evidence is out. The investigators have it. You have a very short window before the calls start coming. I'd use it to find a lawyer. Calloway looked at her for a long time. Then he looked at Grizz. You understand, Calloway said, that providing assistance to this situation, whatever you've done here tonight, creates exposure for this organization. Grizz said nothing. I have relationships with people who have interests in how federal agencies prioritize their attention, Calloway said. The Hells Angels MC has not had a clean relationship with federal law enforcement. I can make that relationship worse, or I can... Stop, Grizz said. Calloway stopped. Grizz looked at him. Not with anger, not with the thing Richard had expected to see. He looked at Calloway the way a man looks at something he has already fully evaluated and found to be exactly what he thought it was. You drove here this morning, Grizz said, because you thought you could walk in and find a lever, money or fear or something. You thought a biker clubhouse was the kind of place where you could buy what you needed or threaten what you couldn't buy. He paused. You were wrong about that. I'm not threatening. You are, Grizz said simply, and I want you to understand something. Not as a threat back, as a fact. He looked at Calloway with complete steadiness. We have been here a long time, longer than Crestfield Partners, longer than your fund. We have had federal attention before the real kind, and we are still here. And a man in a suit who drives a clean car and sits across a table and talks about relationships with federal agencies. He stopped. That is not something that worries me. Calloway looked at him. What worries you? Calloway said. Nothing in this room, Grizz said. The silence that followed was the most complete silence of the entire night. It was the silence of a man who has played every card he arrived with and watched each one fail to land, and who is now sitting with an empty hand across from people who are not afraid of him and who must reconcile that reality with 61 years of being the person in the room that other people were afraid of. Richard watched Calloway absorb it. He watched the man's hands on the table. Still, So carefully still, and then from the back of the room, Dutch said, "Mr. Calloway?" Calloway looked at him. Dutch held up a page from the folder. Page 9. You want to tell me whose signature this is authorizing the Q3 distribution from Meridian Holdings LLC to the Virginia account ending in 4471? Calloway looked at the page. He looked at Dutch. Because it looks like yours, Dutch said, and it's dated 11 days after the shell was formed, which means you weren't overseeing a structure that someone else built. You were directing it from the first quarter of operation. He set the page down. That's not a management failure. That's principal involvement. Calloway said nothing. Q3 alone, Dutch said, was $4.2 million. Still nothing. Over 18 months, Dutch said. At the rate documented in the first 14 pages of what's in front of me, I make it closer to 41 million. Not 37. Sophie's conservative estimate was 37. I think the real number is 41. Sophie looked at Dutch. Dutch looked back at her. Page 11 through 13. The Q1 figures were underreported in the summary because 2 of the transactions were booked as management fees rather than distributions. They're still laundering. They're just labeled differently. Sophie opened her laptop. Her hands moved. The release package used my summary figures. Call whoever you sent it to, Dutch said. Send a correction, 41 million, in the Q1 reclassification. It matters for the charging threshold. Sophie was already typing. Calloway watched her type. And in that moment, watching a 22-year-old woman at a table in a biker clubhouse send a correction to federal investigators that added $4 million to the documented fraud figure, Robert Calloway did something that Richard did not expect. He laughed. Not a long laugh, not a happy laugh. The short, compressed laugh of a man who has just seen the full shape of how completely he miscalculated and whose only available response is the acknowledgement of it. You're 22 years old, he said to Sophie. Yes, she said without looking up from the keyboard. I hired you 18 months ago. You did. And in 18 months, 19, she said. He stopped. 19 months, she said. I started in February. You're counting from my first reconciliation assignment in March. The February onboarding period is when I first flagged the fee structure discrepancy that eventually led me to the shells. She looked up. 19 months. Calloway looked at her. He stood up. He straightened his overcoat. He picked up nothing because he had brought nothing in. He looked at Grizz and at Hawk and at Richard against the wall, and he looked at the room around him, the table, the coffee, the legal pad, the folder, the open laptops, the accumulated evidence of a night that had undone 18 years of careful construction in the time it took to press one key. I'd like to leave, he said. Doors behind you, Grizz said. Calloway walked to it. He had his hand on the handle when Richard said, Mr. Calloway. Calloway stopped, turned. Richard had pushed off the wall. He was standing in the middle of the room. He had not planned what he was going to say, and he had no particular strategic value to add. He was a construction foreman from Allegheny County whose daughter had just dismantled 18 years of a man's fraud operation from a laptop at a biker clubhouse table, and he had one thing left that he needed to say. She sent you a report, Richard said, the first day, before the suspension, before any of it. She sent it up the chain to her supervisor because she believed in the process. She believed that if you told the right people the right information, things got fixed. He paused. She believed that because nobody had ever taught her otherwise. She grew up believing that institutions worked, that if you found something wrong and reported it correctly, the people above you would want to know. Calloway stood at the door. You taught her they don't, Richard said. You took a 22-year-old woman who believed in doing the right thing through the right channels, and you showed her that the channels don't work, that the people at the top of the channels built the problem themselves. He looked at Calloway with the steady, unadorned clarity of a man who has spent 31 years dealing in load-bearing facts. That's what I want you to carry out of here, not the charges, not the investigation. That specific thing you took from her, the part where she used to believe the system worked. Calloway said nothing. He opened the door. He walked out. The gravel crunched under his feet, and then the car door opened and closed, and the engine started, and he pulled out of the lot slowly, the same measured pace he'd come in with, because he was still the kind of man who didn't let his driving announce what his face was doing. The room was quiet. Sophie had stopped typing. She was looking at her father. Richard turned from the door. He looked at his daughter across the room, and she looked back at him, And neither one of them said anything because the thing between them in that moment was too large and too old and too specifically theirs to be said in front of witnesses. It was the thing that had been there since she was 8 years old, taking apart a clock since she was 12, teaching herself algebra since she was 17, asking what the next harder problem was, the specific recognition between a parent and a child of who the child has become, and the complicated love that lives in seeing something you made surpass everything you imagined for it. Grizz looked at the door where Calloway had left. Then he looked at Sophie. "How long before the first callback?" he asked. Sophie checked her screen. "One of the journalists has already responded. The Federal Oversight Unit has a standard 48-hour acknowledgement window, but I'd expect a preliminary contact within." Her phone buzzed on the table. She looked at it. She picked it up. She read the screen. She set it down carefully with both hands, the way you set something down when you need a moment before you speak. "The Oversight Unit," she said. That was fast. "What do they want?" Dutch asked. "A call," she said, "as soon as possible. They want to speak with the analyst who compiled the package." She looked up. "They used the word urgent." Dutch exhaled slowly. $41 million in a state political connection tends to move the timeline. "What does urgent mean?" Richard asked. "It means they're already moving," Sophie said. "It means somewhere right now someone with actual authority is looking at what I sent and making calls of their own." She looked at the phone. "It means it's real. It's actually real." She had held herself together through everything. Through the midnight drive and the midnight knock and the long night of building and the storage unit fire and the Calloway email and the send and the confrontation. She had held herself with the particular rigidity of someone who has decided that feeling things is a luxury she cannot afford until the work is done. The work was done. Sophie Miller put her face in her hands. She did not cry loudly. She was not that kind of person. She made almost no sound at all. But her shoulders moved and Richard crossed the room and stood behind her chair and put both hands on her shoulders, and she reached up and held his hands and shook quietly for about 30 seconds. Then she stopped. She took a breath. She picked up the phone. She called the number. The call lasted 22 minutes. Sophie took it at the table with Dutch beside her. To answer questions, she flagged to him with a look and a pointed finger at a specific document. Grizz sat at the far end and said nothing. Richard stood behind Sophie's chair and said nothing. Hawk had gone back to the window, old habit, or possibly just the right thing, or both. When the call ended, Sophie set the phone down. "They have a forensic accounting team," she said. "They're going to want original documentation. I told them about the storage unit fire." She paused. "They already knew. They said there was a report filed at 4:17 this morning. They said the timing relative to my submission was..." She stopped. "They used the word notable." "They're treating it as connected," Dutch said. "Yes." "Good," Dutch said, "because it is." Sophie looked at Grizz. "They asked where I was. I told them I was in a safe location with people I trusted. They asked if I needed law enforcement at my location." She paused. "I told them I didn't." Grizz looked at her. "I told them the location was already secure," she said. Something moved through Grizz's expression that was as close to a smile as his face typically got, a fractional adjustment around the eyes, a slight ease in the set of his jaw. "All right," he said. "They want me to come in. Tomorrow morning. Pittsburgh field office." "We'll get you there," Grizz said. Sophie looked around the room, at Dutch and his legal pad, at Hawk at the window, at Tommy, who had made approximately 11 pots of coffee since midnight and looked like he might make one more, at her father standing behind her with his hands on her shoulders, warm and solid, and exactly where he'd been since the beginning. She looked at the door where Calloway had walked out 20 minutes ago. She looked at the table where the folder sat organized now into the sequence Dutch had built, ready for investigators who would spend the next months working through it with tools and authority she'd never had. She looked at her laptop closed, now its work complete. "What happens to him?" she asked. "Not to anyone specific. To the room," Dutch answered. "Calloway, he lawyers up today. The firm freezes assets within 48 hours when the federal contact comes. Fitch panics. Fitch is the type and calls his own lawyer separately, which creates a conflict that Calloway's team won't be able to manage. He turned his pen in his fingers. Wild disappears for about 10 days and then his attorney makes contact. That's always how the architects go. They think distance buys them time. Does it? Sophie asked. His formation signatures are on public documents, Dutch said. There's no distance from that, Richard said from behind Sophie. And the political connection, the name on the Cayman account. Dutch was quiet for a moment. That takes longer. That's not a 48-hour problem. That's a 2-year problem. But it's a problem that now exists which it didn't yesterday. He paused. Names on buildings don't make you invisible to federal investigators. They just make the process more careful. Sophie nodded. She looked at Grizz one more time. He threatened you, she said, before he left. He implied he could bring federal attention to this club. He did, Grizz said. Does that worry you? Grizz considered the question with genuine seriousness, the way he considered all questions. A man who just watched his 18-year operation unravel at a table full of witnesses, whose name is now in 43 inboxes, who drove out here this morning and achieved nothing. He stopped. That man is managing his own survival right now. He doesn't have the time or the capacity to focus on us. But later, Sophie said, after the lawyers, after the dust settles. Later, Grizz said, is a long way from now, and we've been here a long time. Sophie held his gaze. Then she did something she had not done since she walked through the door at midnight. She looked at Grizz and let her face show what she was actually feeling, not the controlled expression, not the analyst composure, not the structure she'd built over 19 months of working in the dark alone. She let him see the weight of it and the relief under the weight and the exhaustion under the relief. Thank you, she said. Grizz looked back at her. Get some sleep, he said. You have a long day tomorrow. Sophie looked at her father. Richard looked at his daughter. Sleep, he said. She picked up the canvas bag. She picked up the laptop. She walked to the side room. The door closed. The lock engaged from inside. The blue glow did not appear in the gap at the bottom. She had turned the light off. She was sleeping. Richard stood in the middle of the room and breathed. Just breathed. He was 58 years old and had not slept in 31 hours and had driven 400 miles in 3 days and had knocked on a door at midnight in the dark and somehow ended up on the right side of something that had started going wrong before he'd even understood it was happening. Grizz came and stood beside him. Neither man spoke. Outside, the light was changing, not visible through the walls, but audible in the way sounds change when darkness gives way to morning. Birds, the distant pulse of a highway waking up. It's going to be all right, Richard said. He didn't know if he was saying it to Grizz or to himself. Yeah, Grizz said. You can't know that. I know enough of it, Grizz said. The part that matters tonight. Richard thought about Highway 68 in late October 3 years ago. Rain on the windshield, a man down on the off-ramp, 11 cars going past. He thought about the decision that had taken maybe 4 seconds. Pull over, pull over. Now it costs you nothing that matters, and how he had made it without understanding that it was the kind of decision that comes back around. He thought about his daughter sleeping in a locked room in a biker clubhouse after dismantling a $41 million fraud operation with a laptop and 19 months of patience. He thought about the fact that the world was a stranger and more connected place than he had previously given it credit for. Grizz, he said, yeah. Thank you for stopping on the highway, he said. 3 years ago, the man who went down the rider you were before all this for not dying, for being here. Grizz was quiet for a moment. Thank you for pulling over, he said. They stood there in the changing light and let that be enough. Sophie slept for 4 hours and 40 minutes. Richard knew the exact duration because he had not slept at all. He had sat against the wall with a cup of coffee that went cold, and then gotten a second cup that went cold also, and he had sat with the particular wakefulness of a man whose body is exhausted and whose mind refuses to agree. He listened to the sounds of the building, the shift changes of men coming and going, the low conversation at the far end of the room, Dutch snoring quietly in the corner chair with his legal pads still on his lap. When the lock disengaged at 10:14 in the morning and Sophie came through the door, she looked different, not rested exactly. 4 hours and 40 minutes was not enough to undo 3 months. But she looked like a person who had set something down and had not yet picked it back up, and the absence of that weight, even temporary, changed the way she carried herself. She was upright in a way she hadn't been since Richard had watched her walk into his house 3 weeks ago with a bruise on her jaw. She looked at her father against the wall. You didn't sleep, she said. I slept a little. You didn't. I rested. She sat down across from him. She looked at his face with the thoroughness of someone taking inventory. You look terrible. Thank you. I mean it kindly. I know you do. She reached across and put her hand on his arm briefly the way adults do when they want to make contact without making a production of it. Then she pulled her hand back and looked at the room. Dutch was awake now, blinking. Grizz was at the table with a mug. Hawk had come back in from wherever he'd been and was eating something standing up. The Pittsburgh field office, Sophie said to Grizz. I need to be there by 10 tomorrow morning. Okay, Grizz said. They want the original folder, she said. Dutch's organized version. Dutch looked up from the legal pad. It's ready. And they want a statement, my account of events from the initial discovery through last night, written before the in-person meeting. How long? Richard asked. As long as it needs to be, she said. She picked up her laptop. She opened it. Then she stopped. She looked at the screen for a moment. Then she looked at Grizz. There's something I need to tell you, she said, about the 43 recipients. Grizz set down his mug. Tell me. 42 of them were journalists, investigators, and congressional staffers, she said. The 43rd, she paused. 6 weeks ago, when I built the Dead Man's Switch, I added a contact I had never spoken to directly. A name I found through 3 degrees of research. Someone who works inside a federal agency and who has a documented history of acting on whistleblower submissions when institutional channels are too slow. She met Grizz's eyes. I added that contact because I thought I might die before I could file properly, and I wanted someone inside a federal agency to have the package regardless of what happened to me. And Grizz said, and that contact responded at 6:52 this morning, Sophie said, while I was sleeping. They didn't respond to me directly. They responded to the oversight unit. They flagged the submission as a priority intake and attached a note that said, and, I'm quoting. She turned the laptop so Grizz could see the forwarded email. This package represents the most complete private sector fraud documentation I have received in 11 years of oversight work. Handle accordingly. The room was very quiet. Dutch said, handle accordingly. That's language, Hawk said from the back. That's specific language. It means they're not filing it, Dutch said slowly. It means they're opening it. There's a difference between an agency that receives a fraud complaint and an agency that receives something that someone with 11 years of experience calls the most complete private sector fraud documentation they have seen. He looked at Sophie. That's not a review process. That's an investigation that already started. Sophie closed the laptop. I know. When did you know? Richard asked. 6:52 this morning, she said, when the email came in, and you slept anyway. I had already done everything I could do, she said. There was nothing left to do except sleep. Richard looked at his daughter. She looked back at him. I taught you that, he said. When a pour is done, you clean your tools and go home. The concrete sets without you watching it. Yes, she said. You did. They spent the rest of the morning building the written statement. Sophie drafted. Dutch edited for legal precision the language of documented fact versus inference, the framing that would survive cross-examination. Richard read each section aloud after Dutch finished with it because reading aloud catches what reading silently misses, and because Sophie's ears were too close to the material to hear the gaps. It took 6 hours. At one point, 30 minutes into the third section, Sophie stopped typing. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the table and said nothing for about 45 seconds. Richard watched her. The recommendation letter, she said. What about it? Calloway wrote me a recommendation letter for graduate school. I mentioned it last night. It's framed on my apartment wall. She paused. It says I have it memorized. I've read it 100 times. It says, Sophie Miller demonstrates an exceptional capacity for pattern recognition, combined with the analytical discipline to follow evidence wherever it leads, regardless of where that destination falls relative to expectation or comfort. She stopped. He wrote that. He wrote exactly that. Dutch said quietly he wasn't wrong. He was describing what he thought was a controlled trait, she said. He thought he was praising a useful skill that was pointed away from him, and he thought he understood the boundaries of it. Her jaw set. He didn't. No, Dutch said. He didn't. She put her hands back on the keyboard. Keep going, Richard said. She kept going. At 4 in the afternoon, Grizz's phone rang. He took the call outside. He was gone for 7 minutes. When he came back, his expression had the specific quality of someone processing information that is significant without being surprising. Gerald Fitch, he said, retained separate legal counsel at 11 this morning. His attorney contacted the oversight unit at 2:15 and requested a proffer session. Sophie's hand stopped on the keyboard. He's going to cooperate, Dutch said. Not a question. Looks that way, Grizz said. Sophie sat back in her chair. Fitch talking changes the timeline. How? Richard asked. Because Fitch was implementation, she said. He knows operational details I couldn't document from the outside. He knows how the money moved through the shells in real time. He knows the Cayman account details, the beneficial ownership layers, the names of people I couldn't get to. She looked at Grizz. If Fitch cooperates fully, the Cayman endpoint isn't a gap anymore. He fills it. From the inside, Dutch said. From the inside, Sophie confirmed, which means the political connection, the name at the bottom of the Cayman structure, is no longer protected by layers of shell corporations and beneficial ownership obfuscation. It's exposed by a cooperating witness with direct knowledge. She let that sit for a second. That's a different kind of case. That's not a fraud case anymore. That's the whole thing, Dutch said. The room sat with that. Outside, somewhere down the county road, a truck passed the ordinary sound of an ordinary afternoon in rural Pennsylvania. A sound that had nothing to do with surveillance or strategy or the weight of what was happening inside this building. Richard listened to it pass. He thought about the fact that the world outside this building had continued its ordinary business through all of it, through the midnight knock and the long night, and the fire and the email and the send, and Calloway at the table, and now this Fitch cooperating, the whole structure beginning to come apart from the inside out. The world did not pause for the significant moments inside it. It just kept going, and the significant moments had to find their way into the current. The call from the Pittsburgh field office came at 5:47. Sophie took it at the table with the laptop open and the written statement in front of her and Dutch at her elbow in case anything technical required confirmation. Richard sat against the wall. Grizz sat at the far end of the table and said nothing throughout. The call lasted 38 minutes. When it ended, Sophie set the phone down and was quiet for a long moment. They have Calloway's passport flagged, she said. Standard procedure when federal fraud charges are anticipated. He can't leave the country. When do the charges come? Richard asked. They wouldn't say, but the investigator I spoke with asked me to confirm 3 specific transaction dates, which means they're already building the charging document, and they needed the dates verified by the primary source. She paused. You don't verify dates for a charging document you're not writing. Dutch made a sound that might have been satisfaction. There's something else, Sophie said. Everyone looked at her. They asked about the storage unit fire, she said, whether I wanted to file a separate complaint related to destruction of evidence. I said yes. The investigator said she said that the timing of the fire relative to my submission combined with the surveillance vehicle documented by... She stopped. She looked at Grizz. They're going to want statements from people here, from witnesses who observed the surveillance vehicle and can document its presence and departure times. Grizz said nothing. I told them that might be complicated, Sophie said, that the people who helped me might have concerns about direct contact with federal... It's fine, Grizz said. Sophie looked at him. Grizz, it's fine, he said again. Quiet, final. If they need statements, they get statements. We observed a vehicle. We documented its presence. We provided shelter to a person in danger. Those are facts. He paused. We don't have anything to hide about last night. Hawk said from across the room. I've got timestamps on the camera feed. Back road and fence line. Exact arrival and departure of the vehicle. Sophie stared at him. You have it on camera. Back camera's been running since 2 in the morning, Hawk said. Motion triggered. I checked it when Grizz told me to. I didn't turn it off after. Sophie looked at Grizz. Grizz looked at Hawk. That, Dutch said from the corner, is what we call corroborating evidence. They left the next morning at 7:30. The drive to Pittsburgh was 2 hours and change on a clear morning, and Richard drove because Sophie needed to use the time to review the written statement one final time, and because driving gave Richard something to do with his hands and his attention, And because he had been driving his daughter places since before she could walk, and some things remained true regardless of everything that changed around them. Grizz walked them to the truck. He walked out without a jacket in the cold and stood by the passenger door, while Sophie loaded the canvas bag and the laptop and the accordion folder, Dutch's organized version rubber-banded and labeled in Dutch's precise hand. Sophie looked at Grizz across the roof of the truck. "I'll need to come back," she said, "for the statements. The investigator said within 2 weeks." "We'll be here," Grizz said. "I know." She paused. "That's not actually what I meant." He looked at her. "I meant I'll want to come back," she said. "Not for the investigation. Just—" She stopped. She was not a person who struggled for words usually. She struggled now. "You gave me 4 days. You gave me a locked room and people who didn't ask questions and enough time to finish something I'd been building alone for months. And I know that's what we agreed to, and I know you did it because my father knocked on your door, and you have a rule," Sophie, Grizz said. She stopped. "You're welcome here," he said. "Whenever. That's not a complicated thing." She looked at him for a moment. Then she got in the truck. Richard looked at Grizz across the roof. Grizz looked back. "Highway 68, Richard said. "Yeah. I would have pulled over for anybody," Richard said. "I want you to know that. It wasn't I didn't know who you were. I would have stopped for anyone." "I know that," Grizz said. "I'm glad you didn't die." "I'm glad you didn't drive past," Grizz said. Richard got in the truck. He started the engine. He pulled out of the gravel lot and onto the county road, and in the mirror, he watched Grizz standing there, not watching them go, exactly just standing in the cold morning air, the way he stood in rooms with the complete stillness of a man who does not perform anything, who simply is what he is and leaves it at that. The mirror emptied as they turned north. Neither Richard nor Sophie spoke for the first 10 minutes. Then Sophie said, "He lost a daughter." "I know," Richard said. "He told you?" "He told me he had one, past tense, that was all." Sophie looked at the road. "He never said a word about it. Not when he was talking to me about protection, about safety, about why he was helping. He helped." "Yeah," Richard said. "A man who lost a daughter," Sophie said, "opened his door at midnight for somebody else's." Richard kept his eyes on the road. "Yeah," he said, and his voice was level and even and required considerable effort to keep that way. Sophie reached across and put her hand on his arm. She left it there. They drove. The Pittsburgh field office was 12 stories of federal bureaucracy in a building that smelled like carpet cleaner and recirculated air, and the specific staleness of institutions that process serious things every day until the seriousness becomes ordinary. It was not ordinary for Sophie. She walked in with the canvas bag over her shoulder and the accordion folder under her arm, and her father beside her, and she told the woman at the desk her name, and the woman made a call, and 40 seconds later a man in his 40s in a gray suit came through a door and extended his hand and said he was Special Agent David Marsh and that he was glad she'd come in. He looked at Richard. "This is my father," Sophie said. Marsh shook Richard's hand. "He's welcome to wait in the conference room," and he said, "This may take a while." "However long it takes," Richard said. It took 6 hours and 20 minutes. Richard sat in a conference room with a window that looked at another building's windows and drank 3 cups of federal office coffee that was worse than what Tommy had made at the clubhouse, and read a magazine from 2024 twice without absorbing a word of it. A woman brought him a sandwich at noon that he ate without tasting. At one point around 2 in the afternoon, the door opened and Sophie came in. She looked at him. He looked at her. "They're pulling Callaway's financial records," she said, "all of them. Personal accounts, corporate accounts, anything with his name or his signature in the past 10 years. She sat down across from him. "Marsh says they expect to issue a formal target letter to Callaway's attorneys within 72 hours. A target letter means he's the subject of a federal grand jury investigation." Richard sat with that. "And Fitch's proffer session is tomorrow. Marsh wouldn't give me details, but he said the cooperation is substantial." She paused. "He said substantial. He used that word twice. And the political name, the Cayman account." Sophie was quiet for a moment. "Marsh said he said some aspects of the investigation will take longer, that some threads require more careful handling." She looked at her father. "He said careful, not slow, careful. Careful means they're going there, Richard said. Yes, Sophie said, it means they're going there. She looked at the window, at the other building's windows, at the gray afternoon light of Pittsburgh in November. Dad, she said, yeah. I'm going to be okay, she said. He looked at her. I know. I don't mean eventually, I mean. She stopped. I mean, I can feel it. Whatever has been sitting on me since this started, since before this started, since the day I found the first discrepancy and knew what I was looking at and understood that I had to decide what to do about it. She pressed her hand flat on the table. It lifted. I can feel that it lifted. Even with everything still ahead, the investigation, the testimony, whatever comes next, the thing that was on me is gone. Richard looked at his daughter across the conference room table. Good, he said. Is that stupid to say that now when it's not over? No, he said. The weight of a thing and the thing itself aren't the same. The weight was the secrecy, doing it alone. The thing, the actual thing, is just process now. It's next steps. Those you can handle. She looked at him. When did you get wise? I've always been wise, he said. You just weren't listening. Sophie almost laughed. Almost. Then she did. It was brief and real and entirely hers, the laugh of a 22-year-old woman who has been living inside a crisis for so long that the sudden appearance of something genuinely funny feels almost physical, like a window opening in a room that's been sealed. Richard heard it and felt it land somewhere in his chest that he would not describe to anyone. Go finish, he said. I'll be here. She stood. She went back through the door. He sat. He was there. Whoa. 3 weeks later, the first news story ran. Not a local story, national. A reporter at a paper that had been sent Sophie's package on the night of the send had spent 3 weeks verifying, cross-referencing, making calls, pulling public records. The story ran 42 column inches with a headline about financial fraud and real estate shell companies and a federal investigation that had already resulted in the issuance of target letters to 2 executives at a Pittsburgh-based investment firm. Callaway's name was in the 4th paragraph. Wiles' name was in the 7th. The Cayman Holding Company was referenced obliquely in the 11th paragraph with a note that federal investigators were examining offshore financial structures associated with the firm. Sophie read the story on her phone at 7 in the morning, sitting at the kitchen table in her father's house in Allegheny County, where she had been staying since the night they left the clubhouse. She read it twice. She set the phone face down on the table. Richard came in from the back door with mud on his boots and coffee in his hand. It ran, she said. He looked at her. How is it? Accurate, she said. They got the details right. They were careful. She looked at the phone. Marsh called me last night, and after I'd gone to bed, he left a voicemail. He said the story was coming, and he wanted me to know before I saw it. She paused. He said the investigation was proceeding and that they anticipated additional developments within 60 days. 60 days, Richard said. He said additional developments, Sophie said. He said it twice, the same way he said substantial twice in the conference room. I think that's how he communicates things he can't say directly. Additional developments meaning the Cayman name, Sophie said, meaning the political money, meaning the thread that takes longer and requires careful handling. She looked at her father. 60 days. Richard sat down across from her. He set his coffee on the table. He looked at his daughter in the morning light of his kitchen in the house where she had grown up, where she had taken apart a clock at 8 and taught herself algebra at 12 and left for a future he'd been proud of without knowing it would bring her back here. Like this change tested carrying something that had made her both harder and truer than she'd been before. What do you need? He asked. Right now. She thought about it. Breakfast. That I can do, he said. He stood. He went to the stove. He made eggs the way he had made them since she was small, scrambled with too much pepper in the cast iron pan that had been his mother's. The sound and the smell of it filled the kitchen with the specific normalcy of a Tuesday morning in November in a house where people had been fed for 30 years. Sophie sat at the table and looked at her phone and then turned it face down again. She looked at the window. I'm going back to the clubhouse next week, she said. For the statements, Marsh's team needs Grizz and Hawk on record about the surveillance vehicle. I'll drive you, Richard said. I know you will. You don't have to. Dad, she said. I know you will. It wasn't a complaint. He turned from the stove. He looked at her. She looked back at him with her mother's green eyes and the specific expression she had inherited from no one, the one that was entirely hers that he had watched develop across 22 years and still did not have a complete name for that was composed of equal parts precision and stubbornness and a kind of open-eyed readiness for difficulty that he found both terrifying and extraordinary. Okay, he said. He turned back to the eggs. They drove to the clubhouse on a Thursday. It was colder than the first night, the kind of cold that has committed to itself that is not a warning of winter, but winter itself settled in and certain. The county road looked different in daylight, shorter somehow, less ominous. The gravel lot was just a gravel lot. Grizz came out before they reached the door. He looked at Sophie. She looked at him. You look better, he said. I slept, she said, multiple times, in a row. Good. Hawk came out behind him. He had a phone in his hand and a folder under his arm. I printed the camera timestamps, he said, and I made a copy of the footage on a drive. Marsh's people said they'd send someone for the original equipment, but I wanted a copy in hand. Sophie looked at the folder. You printed them yourself. Dutch made me do it twice, Hawk said. Said the first format wasn't clean enough. Dutch is here, Sophie said. Dutch is always here, Grizz said. He retired, remember? He's got nowhere else to be. Sophie almost smiled. The statements took 4 hours. A junior agent from the Pittsburgh office drove out and sat at the clubhouse table with a recorder and a legal pad and asked questions with the careful politeness of someone who is young enough to be slightly unnerved by the setting, but professional enough not to show it more than twice. Grizz answered every question with complete precision and zero embellishment. Hawk produced the camera footage and the printed timestamps and walked the agent through them with the patience of a man explaining something simple to someone who needs the time. Dutch sat at the end of the table and did not speak unless addressed directly, at which point he produced the exact document being referenced before the agent finished asking for it. When it was done, the agent shook everyone's hand and said the footage was excellent and drove away. The room settled. Richard stood against the wall, the same wall he'd stood against the first night, though it felt different now. Less like a man bracing himself and more like a man who knows where he stands. Tommy brought coffee. Sophie sat at the table with her hands around the mug. She looked at Dutch. How are you, she asked. Retired, Dutch said. Bored, occasionally useful. He looked at her. How's the investigation moving, she said. Marsh called 2 days ago. Grand jury convened. Calloway and Fitch are both subjects. She paused. And the Cayman name, Dutch leaned forward slightly, is being pursued through international cooperation channels, she said, which is slower, but Marsh said the documentation I provided gave them sufficient foundation to make a formal request to the Cayman Financial Reporting Authority. She looked at Dutch. Your Q1 reclassification, the $4 million, that pushed the total over a threshold that triggers mandatory cooperation under an international agreement. Dutch sat back in his chair. You're telling me, he said slowly, that my finding those $4 million on pages 11 through 13 pushed the documented amount over the treaty threshold, Sophie said. Yes. Dutch was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, I'm going to need another cup of coffee. Tommy appeared with the pot before Dutch finished the sentence. So, an hour later, Sophie was standing outside. She had walked out without announcing it, just stood up from the table and went through the door, and Richard had given her 30 seconds and then followed. She was standing in the gravel lot, not looking at anything in particular. Looking at the sky, maybe, or looking at the middle distance that isn't quite sky and isn't quite ground, the place where people look when they are having a conversation with themselves. Richard stood beside her. They were quiet for a while. What are you thinking of? He asked. I'm thinking about the first night, she said. When we pulled into this lot, do you remember what I said? You said it looked like we were about to get murdered. And you said we weren't. I was reasonably confident, he said. She looked at the building, at the metal walls and the hand-painted sign and the door that had opened at midnight for 2 people with no other place to go. I was so scared, she said. I was scared every minute from the moment I found the first discrepancy until... She stopped. Until I pressed send the whole time. Every day, I woke up scared and went to sleep scared and spent the hours between trying not to let it change what I was doing. I didn't know, Richard said. I know you didn't. I didn't want you to. She looked at him. Not because I didn't trust you, because I knew if you knew the full shape of it, you'd want to fix it, and there wasn't anything you could do to fix it. I needed you to be available for the thing you could actually do, which was get in the truck when I called. Richard absorbed that. You managed me, he said, a little, strategically. Dad? I'm not angry, he said. He stopped. He thought about the word and couldn't find one that was exactly right and settled for the truth of it. I'm proud of you, in a way that I don't have language for. What you did, not just the evidence, not just the investigation. The decision you made at the beginning, to report it, knowing what it was going to Chad. Sophie looked at the ground. It cost a lot, she said. Yes. I lost my job. I lost my apartment. I haven't been back. I lost a mentor who turned out to be the person I was reporting. I lost months. She paused. I lost the version of myself that believed the process works automatically. And what did you get? Richard asked. She was quiet for a moment. A better version, she said. One that knows the process doesn't work automatically, but can be made to work if somebody applies enough pressure in the right places. She looked at the door of the clubhouse. And I got this, which I didn't expect, which I couldn't have predicted. What is this? Richard asked. She thought about it. A place where someone answered at midnight, she said, when nobody else would. Richard looked at the door. He thought about 11 cars passing on a highway in the rain. He thought about the 12th car, which was his pulling over. He thought about the way things connect across time in patterns you cannot see until you are standing at the right angle, looking back the pullover that became the knock, that became the open door, that became the locked room, that became the send, that became the investigation, that became slowly consequence arriving at full speed for people who had been certain it never would. Dad, Sophie said, yeah, thank you for knocking. He looked at her. I knocked because you needed me to. I know, she said. Thank you for being the kind of person who does things because someone needs them to, without calculating whether it costs you, without deciding first if it's worth it. She looked at him with everything. She was the precision, the stubbornness, the open-eyed readiness, and underneath all of it, the simplest thing, which was a daughter who loved her father. You've always been that person. I've always known it. I just needed it in a way I'd never needed it before. Richard looked at his daughter in the cold November light. He did not have a response that was adequate. So he did what he had done at midnight in a gravel lot when he didn't know what to say. He simply stayed. Present, solid, exactly where she needed him to be. Grizz came out of the building behind them. He stood in the doorway for a moment, taking in the cold air, not intruding on what he'd stepped into. Then he came and stood beside Richard the way he had on the first morning when the light was changing and the crisis was settling, and neither man had needed to say anything. The three of them stood in the gravel lot. Nobody spoke. Inside, Dutch was doing something with papers. Tommy was making another pot of coffee. Hawk was on his phone, probably doing the quiet operational thing he was always doing. The building was alive with ordinary purpose of men doing the ordinary work of a life built around loyalty and presence and the specific code of people who have decided what they stand for and do not negotiate it. Sophie looked at Grizz. When this is fully over, she said, when Calloway is charged and Fitch has testified and whatever happens with the Cayman name has happened when it's all the way done, can I come back? Not for the investigation. Not for anything official. Grizz looked at her. Just to sit here for a while, she said, in a place that answered. Grizz was quiet for a moment. Doors always open, he said. Sophie nodded. She turned back toward the truck. Richard looked at Grizz one final time. Grizz looked back. There was nothing left to say that had not already been said, and they both knew it, and the knowing of it was itself a kind of completion, the specific satisfaction of a thing that has been built correctly, that bears the weight it was designed to bear, that will stand. Richard turned and followed his daughter to the truck. They drove home through the cold Pennsylvania afternoon with the heater running and the radio low in the particular quiet between two people who have been through something together and have come out the other side, not unchanged but intact, which is all anyone can reasonably ask of the things that test them. 6 weeks later, a federal grand jury returned an indictment. Robert Calloway was charged on 11 counts, including wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy. Gerald Fitch, pursuant to his cooperation agreement, was charged on 4 counts with a recommendation for reduced sentencing. Martin Weil was charged in a sealed indictment that was made public 3 days after Callaway's. The Cayman Holding Company's beneficial owner, the name that had been layered behind shells and offshore structures and 18 years of careful construction, was named in a separate federal filing as a subject of ongoing investigation with a request for international cooperation fully executed. It was not over. These things are never over in a moment. They unfold through courts and filings and testimony and appeals and the slow grinding machinery of accountability, which does not move quickly, but does move when someone has applied the right pressure in the right places and given it enough to work with. But it was moving. That was the thing. It was moving. Sophie Miller went back to school that January. Graduate program. Financial forensics. She told the admissions office when they asked about the gap in her timeline exactly what she had been doing. She told them without apology and without softening and without the slightest indication that she thought it required either. She was admitted. The framed recommendation letter from Robert Callaway was still on her apartment wall when she moved back in. She looked at it for a long time the first night. Then she took it down. She did not throw it away. She put it in a folder with the rest of the documents, the ones that told the story, the whole story beginning to end, and she labeled the folder with a date and put it in the filing cabinet that sat in the corner of her new apartment, which had a deadbolt and a chain and a window lock and absolutely no external hard drives left visible on any desk. And on the first warm day of March, when the winter had finally committed to leaving, she drove out to the clubhouse by herself. She pulled into the gravel lot. She sat in the car for a moment. Then she got out. The door opened before she knocked. Grizz stood in the doorway. He looked at her. She looked at him. "I told you I'd come back," she said. "You did," he said. He stepped back from the door. She went inside. Some doors only open once at midnight, but the ones worth walking through stay open, because the people who answer them understand that protection is not a transaction, that trust is not a calculation, and that when someone has nowhere left to go and chooses to knock anyway, the only right answer has always been and will always be to let them in.